Have you ever been in a room with a group of people, like a family event or a work function, and the temperature of the room just like changes in an instant? Not from it being like hot or cold, but like something crazy happens and there's relational strain. That moment where the room goes from like a little talkative buzz to silence and it feels like your stomach's in your throat. You ever been in one of those moments? Like your crazy Uncle Charlie has one too many and starts complaining about the way your daughter dresses in front of everybody, right? Or your little kid comes running through the common space and says a curse word in front of the conservative grandparents. There's so many ways that the room can just lose all of the momentum that it had, just change in an instant. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was known for her cooking. And one of the crown jewels of her food repertoire was a chocolate cake. She made it like boingy but still moist. It was just a special thing. So every time that we went to the family farmhouse growing up, there always seemed to be some chocolate cake laying around. Now, my great aunt Catherine had a house like a stone's throw away. It had a really long common area, like formal sitting room. You know what I'm talking about, with all the like armchairs and the piano, and then it had a pretty big dining room. So if we had a large family gathering, usually at least one of the meals was held there, just was more spacious, made sense. They had a pool, so kids could go outside. They had a downstairs where you couldn't hear them. You know what I mean? It was a great opportunity. So you'd always bring an offering, a food offering, to these family gatherings. In Canada, they like desserts, and so there's like squares and cake and cookies, all these different things. My grandmother brought her chocolate cake. Now, this story was told at her funeral recently, so I wasn't there for this event. I'm having to even probably just make up parts of it to piece together, but supposedly the story went, she got in, and there's this little table, a little nook in the kitchen where you'd set down desserts, and went to go and set it down. I don't know what happened. I don't know if she misjudged the space. I don't know if she like kind of caught her foot or something, or maybe her attention was drawn elsewhere and it just slipped, but time stood still for a second, or at least slowed down, and everybody in the room somehow caught this visual of the cake falling off the platter and landing irredeemably frosting on the floor, and her face turning blood red. That can change the temperature of the room from joyous celebration to what's going to happen next. Now, if you were a disciple of Jesus, one of the close ones, this feeling of the room temperature changing would be something you might become numb to eventually, or you'd think, because it happens so frequently. If there was anybody who could zap the air out of a room with a comment or an action, it was Jesus. He managed to turn entire crowds of people who were shouting his praises and were so excited about what he was doing into murderous rampages, right, where they're picking up stones to throw it at him. This guy knew what it was like to change the temperature of the room in a moment. You'd think the disciples would be used to it. Well, turns out they're a part of the problem. And we learn this story in John chapter 12. There's a cake drop moment where the temperature of the room changes. And I think we can learn a ton from the story that unfolds. So let me kind of catch you up. From last week, Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back for the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Like, we can't let this dude continue to do this. Soon everybody's going to believe in him. Heaven forbid that, right? we gotta just end this thing hard. So they decide to start trying to kill Jesus really formally. It's not just discussions, it's a plan that's hatched. They convene a high council. The chief priest at the time, Caiaphas, actually prophesies the death of Jesus for the nation. John interprets this theologically, and they put a bounty out on Jesus. It's like a hit job, except instead of kill on sight, it was arrest on sight. So Jesus knows, everybody knows that he's on their hit list. So Jesus and his disciples are forced to go out into the wilderness for a while for it to calm down. But they don't have much time. Remember, time is a theme in the end of John. There's urgency, and there is an urgent time frame. Jesus is out in the wilderness, but Passover's coming. And Passover was the moment where any pious Jew, if they could make it, would be in Jerusalem. So a little while before Passover, you can imagine Jews from all over the known world, the Roman Empire, the diaspora, the Far East, they're coming to Jerusalem. They're making sure they get there early so they have lodging because they're coming from far away. They don't want to get there too late. So they're showing up early, and there's a buzz Because even in the far reaches of the empire, some people have heard about this miracle worker named Jesus. And they're like, who is this man? Am I going to get to hear it? Because they get to town, right? You'd imagine they'd go to the Temple Mount and see the glorious temple, the Solomonic temple, and they'd probably hear, last Passover, Jesus got up in the temple courts and threw us for a serious mess, right? Turning over things. It was a crazy story. So I imagine everybody was like, whoa, are we going to get a glimpse of Jesus? In fact, it literally says so in John 11:56. They're looking for Jesus as they're standing around the temple, and they say to each other, what do you think? He's not going to come, is he? Surely he knows. Right? Like, this is too risky. The hit is out. Everyone knows there's arrest on sight. Jesus wouldn't dare show up. But can you sense the anticipation or the hope that he might still? He won't come, will he? Will he? Well, the answer is really quick for us to discover. John chapter 12, verse 1 says this. 6 days before Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany. Bethany, if you remember, stone's throw from Jerusalem. It's like a little suburb. It was kind of a poor suburb, like the projects. It was even used as a hospice at sometimes. People were sick. They didn't want a pandemic or a plague in the city, so they'd go there and be taken care of. In Bethany, close enough for family members to visit and take care of. He's just outside. It's kind of like a motel. Far enough away where you save some money for the big event. So Jesus arrives in Bethany, where? The home of Lazarus. We just recently talked about him, right? The man he'd raised from the dead. And a dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Now, the Greek paints a picture of a formal banquet. The word used here is reclining at a table, like laying down. They would put their arm on the table. They'd have some pillows to hold up, and their kind of feet would go off to the side. You didn't always eat like this, but when there was a special person in the house, you would. And you could imagine the stories going around the table. Lazarus has literally been raised to life from Jesus. He wants to catch up on what he's missed. He wants to hear the new stories of what Jesus has done. Wouldn't you want to be in that room? It's like the family gathering with the crazy cousin you haven't seen in a long time who always has amazing stories and everyone's glued onto them. You can sense the temperature of the room is up here, right? Lazarus was dead not long ago. He's got to at least be a little hyped that Jesus is back. And Mary and Martha, they've changed their tune. Remember last time Jesus showed up, they came out, why weren't you here when we needed you? The tone has changed. They're all having a blast, but then a cake drops. Martha is cooking, and Mary inches forward. I imagine at first no one's paying much attention. It's her house after all, but then she steals the spotlight in a moment that's going to be forever remembered wherever the gospel is preached. Here's how it goes. Really tiny story, but there's so much jam-packed in it. John 12:3 says this. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made of the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with fragrance. Remember the story? Let me unpack it a little bit to tell you just how profound and impactful this moment must have really been for those who were in the room. A few things to consider. One, regardless how innocent the intention that Mary has in this moment, the posture she takes at Jesus' feet would have been confusing at minimum for the people in the room, and like flagrant and offensive and scandalous at worst. It doesn't seem like much to us as she kneels down to anoint his feet as he's reclining, but remember a couple of things. Mary and Jesus are both single. They're not husband and wife. And do you remember the Old Testament story? I'm testing your Old Testament knowledge here, of Ruth and Boaz. Do you remember how exactly it is that Ruth propositions Boaz to get him to make her his wife? What's she do? She sits at his feet. Whoa. I imagine everybody in the room is just like, you hear the whispers as she kneels down at his feet. And then things are about to get even a little bit crazier because the other Gospels recount her anointing Jesus' head like a king, like the most honored person in the room, the type of person that you anoint as he's about to be like crowned king of the world, right? The messianic hope that everybody was hoping for. But John takes a little bit further. He's either telling a different story or the end of the story that nobody else wants to tell. You can imagine her face is already a little bit red as she's sitting at his feet because everybody is wondering, what on earth is this person doing? Like, how are you gonna suck the energy out of the room like that, Mary? What is she thinking? What is she trying to do? She knows he's a holy teacher, right? You can imagine everything that's going through their head. And what does she do as she's trying to avoid the stare of all the men in the room? She lets down her hair. Which, you and I who cares? To them, it's the equivalent of a woman who's not married in a room hiking up her skirt. This is scandalous. They don't, in the ancient world, you don't show your hair to somebody other than your husband behind closed doors. This was a propositioning type moment. They're like, what is she doing? You could imagine the anger, the confusion, the scandal, everything that's popping up in everybody's head. At minimum, they're probably like, this is disgusting to watch. Who does Mary think she is? Can you feel the tension in the room in this moment? And she breaks the jar and pours it out on Jesus' feet. And even you might be thinking, does that make a lot of sense? Well, Judas in the room says what everybody else is thinking, which is actually curious. John only reports Judas saying this, but the other Gospels, all the disciples were complaining. They wanted to throw Judas completely under the bus here. It even reads like it. John 12:4-6 says this, but Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. And then listen to this character note, not that he cared for the poor, for he was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Now we've learned, I guess, two truths. One is the full character displayed of Judas, right? The intention's not there when he says, what a waste. It's not of a pure heart. But we've also learned the extravagance of the offering. It's not just expensive, like something you'd spend on your like a bonus at Macy's or something buying some perfume. No, it's worth a year's wages. This is your annual salary. She is just poured out on his feet. And it's let me just say this. I think, at minimum, this is worth way more to Mary than just a year's salary. Now, of course, the monetary value is the same, but I just want you to think this through with me for a second. Mary and Martha are living with their brother, Lazarus. What might that mean? It might mean that they probably don't have their own husbands or families that they're taking care of, right? So likely, Lazarus is the one who is bringing in the income. And you know that he's not even doing a great job because they're living in Bethany. They're in the projects. They probably don't have a ton of means. And this isn't the 21st century where Mary, when she's not tied down, can go and pursue a career and maybe even scale up the economy and make some big bucks. This was a time where she didn't really have any ability to make an income other than if she was going to do some really messed up stuff. She just had to rely on her brother. Now, what hope would a Mary or a Martha have in this sort of situation? Well, her parents, when you had a girl in the ancient world, you take my highs down a tiny bit, I'm feedbacking. When you had a girl in the ancient world, you put money aside basically anytime you could to create what's called a dowry. You would want to make sure that your daughter would be attractive to somebody else, not just physically or spiritually, but also financially, because you were seen as a burden on the family. You couldn't work, somebody who had to be taken care of. So Mary and Martha likely had something that they inherited from their parents that would be used as an attractive financial situation for a soon-to-be husband. If they're living in Bethany and they're not working, and Mary doesn't have the ability to save up for something expensive, and they have something in their house worth a year's wages, chances are that is her hope for her future. Chances are that nard, that expensive nard, was supposed to be used as a gift to the person who would be her suitor. A way to say, take me and here's the money to provide for myself. That likely was her entire parents' livelihood poured into her future. So when she breaks this jar, it's not just like she can go back out and keep working for it and save up eventually for another one. She's pouring out her past. And not just hers, but her whole family, all that they've ever worked for, all that she likely presently has, and her hope for the future that the world thought she needed. That's the extravagance of the offering. And it's not just on the head, or it's not just given to him like, here, take this. It's broken and poured out on his feet. Why would you do that? That didn't even happen in the ancient world, by the way. Like, there was no reason to do so. Oftentimes, a distinguished guest, when they came home to a party like this, a servant might wash their feet with some water, because as you're walking in sandals, your feet get dusty. So it would be an appropriate thing. Jesus even has his disciples do this with each other, and he washes their feet shortly in the story. But in this moment, she pours out the most expensive perfume she's got on something that's about to get dirty 30 seconds later. In fact, he's probably reclining against dirty ground. I guess it might be swept out, but there's got to be some dust in there. It's literally poured out, and then she does something that nobody else would do. Lets down her hair, which Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 is a woman's glory. She pours out all she has, all of her dignity, and all of her hope on the feet of Jesus, and everybody in the room collectively looks at this event and says, what a waste. What a waste. That was worth so much. It could have been sold and given to the poor. Think of how many people's lives could have been impacted if we had used this more wisely. And you might even be thinking, man, they have a point. So in this moment, as she's surely embarrassed at minimum, Jesus looks around at all the other people. He knew what they were thinking. And who does he side with? Does he side with the room or Mary? He sides with Mary. He says this, leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. There's more going on here than you know. You'll always have the poor among you. You'll not always have me. This is a moment where all of the disciples who were there, even probably Lazarus and Martha might have been mad because it might have been a split dowry. It might have been partly hers. They're like, no, it's the cake falling irredeemably on the ground. But what everybody else saw as the cake falling, no longer to be used, Jesus saw as Mary cutting the cake and passing it around for the entire celebration. Because Jesus sees the way we pour ourselves out on him differently than the rest of the world does. Maybe even differently than your family members do or your church people do. By the way, after she pours it out, we get this cool line that says the room was filled with the fragrance of this offering. You know, the Greek is the same used in the Greek translations of 1 Kings 8 and Exodus 40, where the tabernacle and the temple are anointed for the Lord, and his glory fills the place. Same words. In this moment where Mary pours out this expensive perfume and everybody says, what a waste, God's glory is thick and present in the room. See, God looks at things differently than other people do. Moment of tremendous significance. It goes beyond even what Mary is expecting, because Jesus is soon to be tried as a criminal and hung on a cross and buried. And in that moment, he would have been denied the option to be anointed with perfumes before he's put away. She's doing this in advance. There's theological stuff going on. God's glory and purpose is here in this moment, and nobody sees it. And the truth is, you just saw on the screen a second ago, if you pour out your life as an offering for Jesus, other people are going to perceive it as a waste. They're going to be like, what? You have a screw loose? Are you telling me you still tithe to your church during the pandemic? Why? Weren't they shut down? Were they even doing anything? Like, you didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. You didn't know if a second stimulus was going to come down. Why would you waste your resources like that? What? You seriously can't come out with us after work on Wednesday? We've asked you like a bazillion times. No, I can't. Why? I'm serving at Crew. It's a priority in my life. Why are you wasting every Wednesday? Like, doesn't your family want you? Couldn't you do other things with your time? Why would you invest in that? When you pour out your life as an offering for Jesus, people are going to look at that and be like, waste of potential. You have any idea how big your retirement account could be right now if you hadn't been given to your church? You have any idea how far your career might have gone if you weren't investing in kids ministry every Sunday morning? When you pour out your life as an offering for Jesus, people are going to be like, what do you think you're doing? And that reaction couldn't be farther from the truth. And John chapter 12 is proof of it. In this age, if you prioritize Jesus with your time, your resources, your dreams, whatever that looks like for you, people are going to look at you and think you're nuts. But such is the madness of the world that even in this moment, with Jesus present, Jesus' 12 disciples, his closest buddies, perceive the same thing of Mary. So next time you're like second guessing whether or not you should be tithing, heaven forbid I give 10% of my income. Just remember, Mary emptied her Roth IRA, her 401k, paid all of the necessary tax penalties for early withdrawal, and gave everything she had to Jesus in one moment. That's what extravagance looks like. That's what devotion looks like. And Mary sets a pretty high standard. This story is all about values. It's not about money. It's about what we value. It's about what we prioritize. And in this world, we're going to have the option to figure out what we are actually willing to put our time and effort and investment into. How we prioritize Jesus reveals what matters to us. So it's a good thing to ask ourselves to reflect. When we read a story like this, is there anything in your life that you can point to that's comparable to what Mary pours out on Jesus? Can you think of a moment, an opportunity, a thing that you've done, maybe something that God's laying on your heart right now, where you're like, that I did that in this moment, and I'd be willing to do it again? Do you see a Mary-type faith operative anywhere in your story? And you might say, Logan, every story is different, right? Devotion to Jesus looks different for you than it would for me. And you're 100% right. I'm not going to get up here and say I've got a cookie-cutter blueprint for exactly what your devotion to God should look like. But I do know this. Your devotion to God shouldn't look any less radical than mine. So I don't care what it looks like for you. That's between you and God. That's a Holy Spirit type deal. The question is, are you following God's call on your life? When you find yourself in a moment like this, are you willing to give it all? Risk whatever you have to. Risk the relationship, right? Risk the job. Maybe it's finances. Maybe it's a dream. Maybe it's putting a sin in your past. Maybe it's moving out of a bad situation that you should have never been in to begin with. Are you willing to risk everything for Jesus? Because we learn through the gospel stories, when we do that, we receive everything in return. Matthew records one additional line of reflection of this story that Jesus deals with. After she pours out the offering and after he defends her publicly, he says this, verse 13, I tell you the truth. Wherever the good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed. Do you know what that means? That means Jesus thinks that Mary's reaction to his presence should be normative for Christians. Not the exception, the rule. Because if he has really saved us from all that we believe he has, if he has really transformed us and given us new life like Lazarus in the room, then we are willing to give anything we have to honor this guy. Think of all the illustrations he's used to talk about the priority of the kingdom. The pearl of great price. The treasure buried in the field. Wouldn't you give all that you had to buy the field so that you could have that treasure? That's what Jesus is asking us to do. So there's no escaping this scenario. John intentionally frames it so that we are one of two characters in this moment. We're Mary or we're Judas. That's a crappy place to be. Are you the type of person who has a normative, extravagant faith, willing to give anything and everything to God's call on your life? Or are you the penny-pinching, deceptive Judas who's saying, what a waste. I could have done better. Crap. Like, take stock of your life today. Which category do you fall into? John frames it that way on purpose, so we're pigeonholed. Like, we have to figure out who we are. So I think the best way to deal with the situation is to let our hair down. Like, girl, let your hair down. Who are you trying to impress? Mary had every reason not to do this in public. Can you imagine what was going through their mind? Lazarus? Like, she's got to sleep there that night. Let your hair down. I don't know what that means for you, but you do. You've probably known for a long time what God has been calling you to do, you to give, you to sacrifice for, you to mentor the next year. Whatever it is, give it to God today. Because if we do, we will receive the highest value in the world. John continues. In a couple of verses later, Jesus is saying this. I tell you the truth, verse 24. Unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. Which is actually pretty recent, her pouring out an offering on his feet that would have been absorbed into the soil. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. Those who love their life in this world want to manage it the way that they think, bring about their own vision for their potential in their life, will what? Lose it. But those who care nothing for their life, whatever the world expects us to prioritize in this world, will keep it for eternity. We live in an age where people out there and people in here are going to look at your radical devotion for Jesus and say, what a waste of potential. But when we waste our life on Jesus, we receive all we've ever hoped for. It's upside down, isn't it? That's the kingdom that we live in. Turns out, there's nothing better to do in this world than waste our life on Jesus. Give everything. Give up all the security. She gave up her hope for a normal future. Are you that radical?